June 4, 1943. The morning air along the Colorado plains smelled of dust and sage, and somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a train whistle cut through the silence. Inside the railcar, 3,000 men sat in darkness, their bodies pressed together, their uniforms still caked with the sand of Tunisia. They were soldiers of the Afrika Korps, veterans of Rommel's desert campaigns, and they had crossed an ocean expecting death. What they found instead would break something inside them, something they had been trained never to question. Private Klaus Hoffman sat near the window, his hands trembling as he watched the American landscape roll past. Fields stretched endlessly, untouched by bombs, golden in the early light. Towns with white-painted churches, cattle grazing as if war were a rumor from another world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had been told that America was crippled, that Allied propaganda had lied about its strength. Yet here, through the glass, was abundance so staggering it felt obscene. Beside him, Corporal Werner Schultz stared at his boots. He had not spoken since the ship docked in Boston 3 weeks earlier. The voyage across the Atlantic had been a revelation in itself. While U-boats hunted them from below, American sailors had served the prisoners hot meals, real meat, vegetables that weren't rotted or frozen. Schultz had wept into his tin plate, not from gratitude, but from the terrible realization that everything he had been told was a lie. The train slowed as it approached Trinidad, a small town nestled against the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Through the dust-stained windows, the prisoners could see people lining the streets, Americans staring back at them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed rage. Children pointed, women clutched their purses. Men in overalls stood silent, arms crossed, remembering sons who would never come home. Hoffman felt his stomach tighten. This, he thought, is where it begins. This is where they make us pay. The doors slid open. Sunlight flooded the car, blinding after hours in the dim. American soldiers stood on the platform, rifles slung casually, their faces unreadable. An officer stepped forward, his voice calm, almost bored. "Welcome to Camp Trinidad. You will follow orders. You will be fed. You will not be harmed." The words hung in the air like smoke. Not be harmed. Hoffman exchanged a glance with Schultz. In the propaganda films they had watched back in Germany, American soldiers were depicted as savages, men who tortured prisoners for sport, who violated the Geneva Convention as easily as they breathed. Yet the officer before them spoke with the tone of a clerk processing paperwork, not an executioner preparing a sentence. They marched through the gates of the camp, past barbed wire fences and guard towers that looked almost decorative in the afternoon sun. The compound was enormous, stretching across 700 acres of scrubland. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat formation, freshly painted, their roofs intact. There was a hospital, a post office, even a theatre. It looked less like a prison and more like a military installation, the kind they had left behind in North Africa. Inside Barrack 14, Hoffman set his meagre belongings on a bunk and stared at the mattress beneath him. A real mattress. Not a pile of straw or a dirt floor, but an actual bed with blankets folded at the foot. He pressed his hand against it, testing its softness, and felt something crack inside his chest. For years, he had slept on tanks, on frozen ground, in trenches filled with mud and the stench of decay. He had learned to sleep through artillery fire, through the screams of wounded men, through the gnawing cold of desert nights. And now, here in the hands of the enemy, he had a bed. That evening, the prisoners were assembled in the mess hall. The smell hit them first, rich and overwhelming, the scent of cooking meat, real coffee, bread still warm, from the oven. They filed through the line in silence, each man receiving a tray piled with food. Mashed potatoes, roast beef, carrots, a slice of cake for dessert. More food than most of them had seen in months. Hoffman sat at a long wooden table, staring down at his plate. Around him, men ate slowly, mechanically, as if afraid the food might disappear if they acknowledged it too openly. Some chewed with their eyes closed, savoring flavors they had forgotten existed. Others simply wept, quietly, their shoulders shaking as they tried to swallow past the lump in their throats. Across the table, an older officer named Hauptmann Erich Kessler set down his fork and looked around the room. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow from too many battles, too many retreats. He had been a lawyer before the war, a man who believed in order, in logic, in the righteousness of the Reich. But here, surrounded by abundance he had been told did not exist, he felt the foundations of his belief begin to crumble. "They are fattening us for slaughter," someone whispered. "This is a trick. They want us soft before they kill us." Kessler said nothing. He knew denial when he heard it. He had spent the last year denying the evidence of his own eyes, the rumors of atrocities, the whispers of camps where people disappeared. But denial had a limit, and tonight, staring at a plate of food meant for the enemy, he had reached it. After dinner, the prisoners were allowed to walk the perimeter of the compound. Hoffman stood near the fence, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, he could hear the sound of cattle lowing, the hum of insects in the dry grass. It was peaceful here, unbearably so. A guard approached, a young private with a face that looked barely old enough to shave. He stopped a few feet away, pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, and offered one to Hoffman. The gesture was so casual, so unexpected, that Hoffman almost didn't take it. But his hands moved on instinct, accepting the cigarette, accepting the lighter that followed. They stood together in silence, two soldiers on opposite sides of a war, sharing smoke under a Colorado sunset. The guard said something in English, words Hoffman didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. It was the tone of someone making small talk, filling the silence, treating him not as a monster, but as a man. When the guard walked away, Hoffman stayed at the fence, the cigarette burning down to ash between his fingers. He thought of home, of the lies he had been told, of the promises that victory was certain. And for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to wonder if he had been fighting for the wrong side all along. Inside the barracks that night, men lay awake in the darkness, too overwhelmed to sleep. Some prayed, others cried quietly into their pillows. A few whispered conversations in the bunks, trying to make sense of what they had experienced. "They are feeding us," Schultz said, his voice barely audible. "Why? Why would they feed us like this?" Hoffman had no answer. In the logic of war, prisoners were burdens, mouths to feed when resources were scarce. Yet here they had been given not just sustenance, but comfort, dignity, even kindness. It defied everything they had been taught about the enemy. Kessler, lying in the bunk below, spoke into the darkness. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we were never told the truth." The words settled over the room like a shroud. No one responded. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge doubt, and doubt was a luxury soldiers could not afford. But the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken agreement, with the weight of men confronting a reality they were not prepared to face. The next morning, the prisoners woke to the sound of a bugle call, crisp and clear in the mountain air. They assembled in the yard, expecting drills, punishment, the grinding monotony of prison life. Instead, they were told they could volunteer for work details, jobs on nearby farms and factories that would pay them 80 cents a day in canteen coupons. 80 cents, the same wage as an American private. Some refused, clinging to pride, to the belief that accepting American charity was a betrayal of the fatherland. But others, weary and hungry for purpose, signed up without hesitation. They wanted to be useful. They wanted to feel human again. Hoffman volunteered. He was assigned to a sugar beet farm 20 miles from camp, a place run by an elderly German immigrant named Heinrich Weber. The first morning, as the truck rattled down dirt roads toward the fields, Hoffman watched the landscape change from scrubland to irrigated farmland, rows of green stretching toward the horizon. Weber met them at the gate, a stooped man with white hair and hands gnarled from decades of labor. He spoke to them in German, his accent thick with the cadence of Bavaria. "You will work hard," he said, but you will be treated fairly, and when the day is done, you will eat." True to his word, Weber worked alongside them, never asking them to do anything he would not do himself. And when the sun began to set, he led them to his farmhouse, where his wife had prepared a meal. Roast chicken, fresh bread, potatoes dripping with butter. She served them with the same care she would give her own family, her eyes soft with something that looked almost like pity. After the meal, Weber's grandmother appeared, a tiny woman with silver hair and a face lined with age. She had been born in Germany, had left as a young bride, and had not returned in 50 years. When she saw the prisoners, her hands flew to her mouth, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. She spoke to them in broken German, asking about their families, their hometowns, the places she remembered from her youth. And when they sang for her old folk songs they had learned as children, she wept openly, clutching her apron to her face. Weber gave them cigarettes before they left, pressing packs into their hands despite the regulations against fraternization. "You are far from home," he said simply. "So was I, once." On the ride back to camp, Hoffman sat in silence, the cigarettes heavy in his pocket. He thought of Weber's grandmother, of her tears, of the way she had looked at them not as enemies, but as boys who reminded her of the country she had left behind. And he realized, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that the war had stolen something from everyone, even those who had never fired a shot. Back at Camp Trinidad, life settled into a rhythm. Days passed in a blur of work and routine. The prisoners grew accustomed to the abundance, the strange kindness of their captors, the unsettling realization that they were being treated better here than they had been in their own army. Some embraced it, allowing themselves to hope that this strange mercy meant something, that perhaps the world was not as cruel as they had believed. Others resisted, clinging to ideology like a drowning man clings to driftwood, terrified that if they let go, they would be swept away by the truth. But the truth had a way of seeping in, slow and relentless, like water through cracks in a dam. It came in the taste of coffee that wasn't chicory and sawdust. It came in the weight of a Hershey bar pressed into a prisoner's hand by a guard who smiled as he walked away. It came in the letters from home, censored and delayed, that spoke of starvation, of cities turned to ash, of a Reich collapsing under its own weight. And for men like Hoffman, who had believed in victory, who had fought with every ounce of strength they possessed, the truth was more devastating than any battlefield defeat, because it meant they had been wrong all along. By late summer, the heat in Trinidad had become oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer above the dirt roads and turned the barracks into ovens by midday. But even the heat could not dampen the strange transformation taking place within the camp's barbed wire fences. The prisoners, once hollow-eyed and defiant, had begun to fill out, their faces regaining colour, their movements less mechanical. They were healing, physically at least, though the wounds inside ran deeper than any doctor could reach. One afternoon, a shipment arrived from the Red Cross, crates stamped with American logos and filled with luxuries the prisoners had not seen in years. Chocolate bars, cans of condensed milk, instant coffee, cigarettes in cartons, not the loose tobacco they had rationed in the trenches. The guards distributed the goods with the same casual efficiency they brought to every task, tossing packages through the fence as if they were throwing feed to livestock. Hoffman caught a Hershey bar mid-air, the wrapper crinkling in his hands. He turned it over slowly, reading the English words he could not understand, feeling the weight of it. It was such a small thing, barely 4 ounces, yet it represented something enormous. In Germany, chocolate had become a memory, a luxury reserved for officers or black market dealers. Here, it was given freely to prisoners, men who had tried to kill the very soldiers now handing them sweets. He unwrapped it carefully, breaking off a single square. The chocolate melted on his tongue, rich and sweet, flooding his mouth with a flavour so intense it made him dizzy. He had forgotten what real chocolate tasted like, forgotten that food could be more than fuel, that it could bring pleasure, comfort, a moment of grace in a world stripped of beauty. Around him, other men stood frozen, holding their own bars, their faces caught between joy and something darker. Sergeant Otto Becker, a veteran of 3 campaigns, bit into his chocolate and began to weep. He tried to hide it, turning his face toward the barracks wall, but his shoulders shook with sobs he could no longer contain. He had been a baker before the war, a man who made cakes for weddings and birthdays, who understood the language of sugar and flour. And now, tasting chocolate in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, he remembered who he had been before the uniform, before the orders, before the lies. Schultz sat on his bunk, staring at the bar in his hand, as if it were a grenade. "They are trying to break us," he said quietly. "This kindness, it is a weapon." Kessler, reading a letter from his wife that had taken 3 months to arrive, looked up. "Then it is working," he said. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "Because I am broken." The letter trembled in his hands. His wife wrote of hunger, of ration cards that bought nothing, of neighbors who had disappeared in the night. She wrote of their daughter, 8 years old, who had asked why the Americans were the enemy when they seemed to have so much food. The question had haunted Kessler since he read it. He had no answer for his daughter, just as he had no answer for himself. That evening, the camp commander announced that prisoners could sign up for classes, English lessons, mathematics, even college courses taught by professors who had been captured and sent to Trinidad. The education was free, the materials provided, the only requirement that they show up and participate. It was an offer so generous, so contrary to everything they expected from captivity, that many simply assumed it was a trap. But Hoffman signed up for English. He told himself it was practical, that knowing the enemy's language might prove useful someday, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know why these people, who had every right to hate him, treated him with more dignity than his own commanders ever had. The teacher was an American sergeant named David Klein, a young man whose parents had fled Germany in 1938. Klein spoke fluent German, his accent carrying the rhythm of Berlin, and he taught with a patience that bordered on tenderness. He did not mock the prisoners when they stumbled over pronunciation. He did not remind them of their sins. He simply taught, as if the war were an inconvenience that had interrupted more important work. One day, Klein brought coffee to class. Not the ersatz coffee the Wehrmacht had served, made from burnt grain and desperation, but real coffee, dark and fragrant, steam rising from tin cups. He poured one for each prisoner, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "In America," he said in German, "we believe that even enemies deserve to be treated like human beings." Hoffman held the cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms. He raised it to his lips and drank slowly, the bitterness cutting through the sweetness of memory. This was not the coffee of home, the coffee his mother had served on Sunday mornings before the war. But it was real, and it was given freely, and that made it more precious than anything he had tasted in years. Across the table, a young prisoner named Franz Müller began to cry. He did not try to hide it, did not wipe the tears that streamed down his face. He had been 17 when he joined the Hitler Youth, 18 when he was sent to Africa, 19 when he was captured. He had never known a world without war, without propaganda, without the constant drumbeat of hatred and fear. And now, sitting in a classroom in Colorado, drinking coffee given to him by a man whose family had fled the regime he had served, he realized he had wasted his youth fighting for something that had never been worth saving. Klein said nothing. He simply refilled Müller's cup and moved to the next student. There was no judgment in his eyes, no triumph, only a quiet sadness that seemed to encompass everything the war had taken from all of them. The weeks turned into months. Autumn came to the Colorado plains, painting the hills in shades of gold and rust. The prisoners continued their routines, working on farms, attending classes, writing letters home that spoke of things they could not fully articulate. Some began to let go of the ideology that had sustained them, allowing doubt to creep in where certainty had once lived. Others clung tighter, forming small groups of die-hard Nazis who policed the barracks, punishing those they deemed traitors with whispered threats and stolen rations. The camp became divided, not by barbed wire, but by belief. On one side were those who accepted the truth of their treatment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, who acknowledged that they had been lied to, that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear. On the other were those who refused, who insisted that American kindness was a trick, that any day now the mask would fall and the real brutality would begin. Hoffman found himself caught between them. He could not deny what he had experienced, the food, the medicine, the simple human decency that no propaganda could explain away. But neither could he fully embrace the idea that everything he had fought for was a lie. To do so would be to admit that his friends had died for nothing, that the years of suffering had been meaningless, that he had been a fool. One night, unable to sleep, he walked to the edge of the compound and stood at the fence, staring out at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. A guard approached, the same young private who had given him a cigarette months earlier. The guard pulled 2 Hershey bars from his pocket, handed one to Hoffman, and leaned against the fence beside him. They ate in silence, the chocolate melting slowly, the night air cool and still. After a while, the guard spoke, his voice soft. Hoffman did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of someone trying to make sense of the same questions, trying to reconcile duty with compassion, trying to figure out how to be human in a world designed to strip humanity away. When the guard finished speaking, Hoffman nodded. He pointed to the sky, to the constellation he had learned to recognize in the desert, and said the German name. The guard smiled, pointed to the same stars, and said the English name. They were different words for the same thing, 2 languages trying to describe a universe that belonged to neither of them. The guard left eventually, his footsteps fading into the distance. Hoffman stayed at the fence, the chocolate wrapper crumpled in his fist, and allowed himself to cry. Not quietly, not with the restrained dignity soldiers were supposed to maintain, but with great heaving sobs that tore through him like artillery fire. He cried for the men he had lost, for the years he had wasted, for the lies he had believed. He cried for the boy he had been before the war, the boy who had dreamed of being a teacher, who had wanted nothing more than a quiet life in a small town. And he cried because he knew, with a certainty that made his chest ache, that he could never go back to being that boy. The war had taken him, chewed him up, and spit out something different, and the kindness of his captors, more than any battlefield defeat, had shown him the full measure of what he had lost. By November, the camp had settled into its strange equilibrium. The diehards remained in their corner, singing Nazi anthems under their breath, plotting escapes that would never happen. The rest adapted, learning English, taking jobs, attending lectures on democracy that seemed almost quaint in their earnestness. The guards stopped seeing them as enemies and started seeing them as men, boys really, who had been swept up in something larger than themselves. A Thanksgiving feast was prepared, an American tradition the prisoners did not understand but were invited to anyway. The mess hall was decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves, a cheerful absurdity that would have been laughable if it were not so profoundly sad. Long tables were set with plates and silverware, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. The prisoners filed in, hesitant and uncertain. They sat in rows, Germans and Americans together, separated only by language and memory. The camp commander stood and gave a speech about gratitude, about the end of the war, about the hope that someday they could all return to their families. His words were translated by Klein, who stumbled over the sentiment, his voice thick with emotion. Then the food was served. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, more food than any of them had seen on a single table in years. The prisoners ate slowly, reverently, as if afraid to offend the generosity being shown to them. Some laughed at the strangeness of it all, eating an American holiday meal with the men who had captured them. Others simply ate in silence, their minds far away, thinking of tables back home that sat empty. Hoffman sat beside Schultz, who had finally begun to speak again after months of silence. They ate together, passing dishes back and forth, and for a moment it felt almost normal, almost like peace. After the meal, a guard brought out a phonograph and played music, American jazz that the prisoners had been told was degenerate, corrupt, the sound of a dying culture. But as the music filled the hall, some began to tap their feet, to sway gently, to let the rhythm move through them. A few even smiled, tentative and fragile, like men remembering how. Kessler stood near the window, watching the scene unfold. He thought of his law practice in Munich, of the cases he had argued, of the belief he had held that justice was something absolute, something that could be measured and weighed. But justice, he now understood, was not found in courtrooms or proclamations. It was found in moments like this, in the simple act of feeding hungry men, in the quiet decision to treat prisoners not as vermin, but as human beings deserving of dignity. He caught Klein's eye across the room. The translator nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. They were both refugees in their own way. Klein from a country that had wanted him dead, Kessler from a belief system that had betrayed everything he thought he knew. And in this strange prison camp in Colorado, they had found something neither expected, the possibility of redemption. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the compound, turning the barbed wire into silver threads, softening the harsh geometry of guard towers and barracks. The prisoners huddled around pot-bellied stoves, drinking hot cocoa that tasted like childhood, like innocence, like everything the war had stolen. American guards brought them extra blankets, heavy wool ones stamped with US, Army markings, and distributed them without ceremony, as if warmth were a right, not a privilege. In the letters they wrote home, censored but truthful, the prisoners struggled to explain what was happening to them. How could they describe to their families, starving in the ruins of German cities, that they were eating chocolate and drinking real coffee? How could they admit that the enemy had shown them more compassion than their own leaders ever had? The words failed them, so they wrote in vague terms about adequate conditions, about work details, about the strange kindness of their captors that they did not fully understand. One December morning, packages arrived from the International Red Cross, Christmas parcels containing small luxuries meant to remind prisoners of home. But mixed in were contributions from American families, churches, and civic groups who had decided that even enemies deserved kindness during the holidays. Hoffman received a package containing a hand-knitted scarf, a tin of cookies, and a card written in careful English. "May you find peace and return home safely to your family." He read the card 3 times, trying to comprehend the sentiment. An American family, people who had every reason to hate him, had spent time and resources to send comfort to a German prisoner. The scarf was soft, expertly made, the kind of thing a grandmother might knit for her grandson. He wrapped it around his neck and felt the warmth seep into his skin, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the war. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and clear skies. The camp chaplain, a soft-spoken Protestant minister from Iowa, organized a service in the recreation hall. He invited all prisoners, regardless of faith, to attend. The hall filled slowly, men shuffling in with curiosity and caution, unsure what to expect. The chaplain spoke in English, his words translated by Klein, about peace on earth, goodwill toward men, about the hope that even in the darkest times, light could find its way through. Then he did something unexpected. He invited the prisoners to sing, to share the Christmas carols they knew from home. The request was met with silence at first, the weight of memory too heavy to bear. But then an older prisoner, a schoolteacher from Hamburg, began to sing Stille Nacht. His voice was thin and wavering, cracked by years of war and the sudden vulnerability of the moment. But it carried, filling the hall with a melody that transcended language, that spoke to something deeper than nationalism or ideology. One by one, others joined in. German voices rose in harmony, singing the song they had learned as children, before the war, before the propaganda, before everything went wrong. The American guards stood at the edges of the room, many with tears streaming down their faces, listening to the enemy sing about peace. When the song ended, the silence was profound. Men sat with their heads bowed, their hands clasped in their laps, unable to look at one another for fear of what they might see in each other's eyes. The chaplain closed the service with a prayer, asking God to bring the war to an end, to heal the wounds of nations, to grant mercy to all who suffered. As they filed out into the cold night, Hoffman felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking on a river in spring. He had spent months resisting, clinging to the identity the war had given him, terrified of what he would become if he let it go. But standing there in the snow, the taste of Christmas cookies still on his tongue, he realized that letting go was not betrayal. It was survival. The new year arrived with news from Europe. The Wehrmacht was in retreat, cities falling one after another, the Reich collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. In the camp, the diehards grew more desperate, insisting that secret weapons would turn the tide, that victory was still possible. But their voices sounded hollow now, like echoes from a world that no longer existed. The others, the ones who had accepted reality, began to plan for the future. They talked about returning home, about rebuilding, about the kind of Germany they wanted to create from the ashes. Some spoke of emigrating to America, of starting over in a country that had shown them more kindness than they deserved. Others simply wanted to find their families, to hold their children, to live quietly and forget that any of this had ever happened. Hoffman continued his English lessons, his pronunciation improving, his vocabulary expanding. Klein brought him books, American novels that painted a picture of a country vast and diverse, filled with people who were neither heroes nor villains, just humans trying to make sense of a complicated world. He read them late into the night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, and felt his understanding of the war shift and expand. One afternoon in March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring touched the Colorado plains, Klein pulled Hoffman aside after class. He handed him a letter, postmarked from Munich, that had taken 5 months to arrive. Hoffman's hands shook as he opened it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of his mother. She wrote of survival, of neighbors who had shown kindness, of the American soldiers who had entered their city with food and medicine instead of vengeance. She wrote of her relief that he was safe, that he was being treated well, that perhaps the war had not taken everything from them after all. And at the end, in a postscript that made his throat tighten, she wrote, "Come home, Klaus. Come home and help us build something better." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket, next to the Christmas card from the American family. 2 pieces of paper, 2 messages of hope from opposite sides of a war that had nearly destroyed the world. He thought of the chocolate bars, the coffee, the blankets, the small acts of kindness that had accumulated over months until they became something larger than themselves. And he understood, finally, what it all meant. It meant that humanity could survive even the worst of itself. It meant that mercy was not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. It meant that the men who had fed him, who had clothed him, who had treated him with dignity when they could have chosen cruelty, were not naive or foolish. They were showing him what the world could be if people chose to see each other as human beings first, enemies second. By April of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final days. News trickled into the camp, fragmentary and censored, but the prisoners could read between the lines. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. The diehards grew silent, their certainty crumbling like the cities they had sworn to defend. The others simply waited, exhausted and numb, for the official word that it was over. When the announcement finally came on May 8th, the camp gathered in the yard. The American commander read the proclamation of German surrender, his voice steady and formal. Klein translated, his words carrying across the compound, settling over the prisoners like a shroud. It was over. The war that had consumed 6 years, that had killed millions, that had reshaped the world in blood and fire, was over. Some prisoners wept, others stood in stunned silence. A few even cheered, relieved that the killing had finally stopped, that they might live to see their families again. Hoffman felt nothing at first, only a profound emptiness, as if something essential had been carved out of him and nothing had rushed in to fill the space. But then he thought of his mother's letter, of her words urging him to come home and build something better. He thought of the chocolate bars and the coffee, of the Christmas carols and the English lessons, of every small kindness that had been shown to him by people who owed him nothing. And he realized that the war's end was not an ending at all, but a beginning, a chance to prove that the mercy he had been shown was not wasted, that he could carry it forward, that he could become the kind of man who deserved it. The months that followed were a strange limbo. The prisoners remained in camp, waiting for repatriation, for the bureaucratic machinery to process them and send them home. Some were transferred to other facilities. Others volunteered to stay, to work on farms and in factories, earning money to send to families who had nothing. The guards, no longer needed in such numbers, rotated out, replaced by men who had never seen combat, who treated the prisoners with a casual friendliness that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Hoffman continued working on Heinrich Weber's farm, helping with the harvest, mending fences, learning the rhythms of a life untouched by war. Weber paid him in cash now, real money, not coupons, and urged him to save it for the journey home. But he also offered him something else, a standing invitation to return after the war, to work the farm as a partner, to build a new life in America if Germany proved too broken to bear. The offer haunted Hoffman. He thought about it at night, lying in his bunk, listening to the sounds of men snoring and shifting in their sleep. He thought about it in the fields, his hands in the soil, the sun on his back. America had shown him kindness, had given him a glimpse of what life could be without fear, without propaganda, without the constant grind of survival. But Germany was home, and home, no matter how damaged, still called to him. In July of 1946, the order came. The prisoners at Camp Trinidad would be repatriated, sent back to a Germany they barely recognized, a country divided and occupied, its cities reduced to rubble, its people broken. They packed their meager belongings, the letters they had received, the photos they had been allowed to keep, the small tokens of their captivity that had become precious over time. On the morning of their departure, the prisoners assembled one last time in the yard. The American commander gave a brief speech, wishing them well, urging them to remember what they had learned, to build a better future. Klein translated, his voice thick with emotion, and when he finished, several prisoners approached to shake his hand, to thank him for his patience, his kindness, his refusal to treat them as monsters. Hoffman was among them. He clasped Klein's hand and held it for a long moment, unable to find words in English or German that could capture what he felt. Klein seemed to understand. He simply nodded, squeezed Hoffman's shoulder, and said in German, "Go home. Make it mean something." The trucks rolled out of Camp Trinidad under clear skies, carrying 3,000 men who had entered as soldiers and were leaving as something else. They drove past farms they had worked, past towns they had glimpsed through fences, past mountains that had watched over them during their strange captivity. Some prisoners looked back, memorizing the landscape, knowing they would never see it again. Others stared forward, their minds already reaching toward home, toward whatever waited for them there. At the port in New York, they boarded Liberty ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. The voyage was long and uncomfortable, the ships overcrowded, the food adequate but plain. Yet even this was better than what many had expected. They had been fed, clothed, treated according to the rules of war. They had been shown that even enemies could be human, that mercy was not a myth, that kindness could survive even in the darkest times. Hoffman stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching the New York skyline recede into the distance. The city gleamed in the afternoon sun, its buildings tall and undamaged, a monument to American abundance that had once seemed impossible. He thought of the chocolate bars, the coffee, the Christmas carols sung in a prison camp on the other side of the country. He thought of the scarf knitted by a stranger, the books lent by a teacher who had every reason to hate him, the simple human decency that had accumulated over 2 years until it became something he could carry inside him. The crossing took 3 weeks. Men played cards to pass the time, told stories, sang songs that had nothing to do with war. They talked about what they would do when they reached home, the families they would find, the lives they would rebuild. Some planned to become farmers, others teachers, a few even politicians, determined to ensure that Germany never again fell into the darkness that had consumed it. When they finally docked in Bremerhaven, the prisoners were processed through a camp run by British forces. The contrast was stark. The British, who had suffered under German bombing for years, were less forgiving, their treatment colder, more suspicious. It was not cruel, but it lacked the strange warmth that had defined Camp Trinidad, the sense that their captors actually cared whether they lived or died. Hoffman was released 3 days later with discharge papers, a small amount of money, and a voucher for train fare to Munich. He stood outside the camp gates, a free man for the first time in 4 years, and felt only exhaustion. The Germany he returned to bore no resemblance to the one he had left. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble. Children with hollow eyes begged on street corners. Women dug through debris, searching for anything that could be sold or traded. The smell of ash and decay hung over everything like a fog. He found his mother living in a single room of what had once been their family home, the rest destroyed by bombing. She was thin, her hair gone white, her hands trembling as she pulled him into an embrace. They held each other in silence, two survivors of different kinds of warfare, both marked by what they had endured. That night, over a meagre dinner of potato soup and black bread, he told her about Camp Trinidad. He described the food, the chocolate bars, the Christmas carols, the English lessons. He told her about the guards who had given him cigarettes, the farmer who had fed him roast chicken, the strangers who had sent him scarves and cookies for Christmas. He told her about Klein, the translator whose family had fled the regime, who had taught him English with a patience that bordered on love. His mother listened in silence, her eyes glistening with tears. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "They showed you mercy," she said quietly. "Now you must show it to others. That is how we survive this. That is how we build something better." In the years that followed, Hoffman worked as a translator, helping to rebuild the relationship between Germany and the Allied powers. He taught English to schoolchildren, using the books Klein had given him, passing on not just the language, but the values he had learned in captivity. He married a woman from his hometown, a teacher who had lost her husband in the war, and together they raised 3 children in a country slowly piecing itself back together. He never forgot Camp Trinidad. On quiet evenings, when the weight of memory became too heavy, he would pull out the Christmas card the American family had sent him, the paper yellowed and creased from years of handling. He would read the words again, "May you find peace and return home safely to your family," and remember that even in the depths of war, humanity had found a way to survive. Some of his fellow prisoners never made it home. They died in the chaos of repatriation, succumbed to illness, or simply disappeared into the vast displacement of post-war Europe. Others returned to America, like the farmer Schultz, who emigrated in 1949 and spent the rest of his life working land in Nebraska, never speaking of the war except to say that he had been shown mercy when he deserved none. Kessler became a judge in the new Federal Republic, spending decades working to rebuild Germany's legal system on principles of justice and human rights. He never forgot the lesson he had learned in that prison camp in Colorado, that mercy was not weakness, that treating even enemies with dignity was not naive but necessary, that civilization survived only when people chose to see each other as human beings first. And Klein, the translator who had bridged the gap between enemies, returned to academia, teaching German literature at a university in California. He maintained correspondence with several former prisoners, including Hoffman, exchanging letters that spoke of the past without dwelling on it, that looked toward the future with cautious hope. In 1963, he traveled to Munich for a reunion of Camp Trinidad prisoners, men who gathered not to celebrate their captivity, but to honor the strange mercy that had saved them. They met in a beer garden on the outskirts of the city, 24 men now grey and softened by age, their war wounds hidden beneath civilian clothes. They drank together, toasted absent friends, and told stories that sounded almost impossible in the retelling. The chocolate bars. The Christmas carols. The Thanksgiving feast. The small acts of kindness that had accumulated over years until they became something larger than themselves. Hoffman stood to speak, his English now fluent, his voice steady. "We came to that camp expecting death," he said. "We had been told you were monsters, that you would torture us, that mercy was a lie the Allies told to make themselves feel righteous. But you proved us wrong. Every day, in 100 small ways, you proved us wrong. You fed us. You clothed us. You treated us like human beings when you could have chosen cruelty. And in doing so, you saved us. Not just our lives, but our souls." He paused, his throat tight with emotion. "Some will say you were too kind, that we did not deserve such treatment. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps we deserved nothing but the harshest punishment for what our country had done. But you chose mercy anyway, and that choice changed everything. It changed us. It changed how we saw the world. It changed what we believed was possible." He raised his glass, his hand trembling slightly. "To Camp Trinidad. To the guards who showed us kindness. To the Americans who fed their enemies chocolate and taught them English. To everyone who proved that even in the darkest times, humanity can survive. May we never forget what you taught us. May we never stop trying to build the world you showed us was possible." The men rose as one, glasses raised, tears streaming down weathered faces. They drank to memory, to mercy, to the strange grace that had found them in a prison camp in Colorado and changed them forever. And in that moment, surrounded by former enemies who had become something like brothers, Hoffman felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift. The war had taken everything from them: their youth, their innocence, their certainty. But in the ruins of all they had lost, something unexpected had taken root. The belief that redemption was possible, that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that even men who had been taught to hate could learn to build bridges instead of walls. Years later, when Hoffman was an old man, his grandchildren would ask him about the war. He would tell them about the chocolate bars, the coffee, the small kindnesses that had saved his life. He would tell them about the translator who had taught him English, the farmer who had fed him roast chicken, the strangers who had sent him Christmas cards. And he would tell them the most important lesson he had learned, the one that had sustained him through decades of rebuilding and remembering. He would tell them that the true victory of the war was not found on battlefields or in peace treaties. It was found in the choice that ordinary people made, again and again, to treat each other with dignity, even when everything around them demanded cruelty. It was found in the simple act of giving chocolate to a starving prisoner, of pouring coffee for a man who had tried to kill you, of singing Christmas carols with the enemy and meaning every word. That, he would say, was what saved the world. Not armies or bombs or grand strategies, but the quiet, relentless insistence that mercy matters, that kindness survives, that even in the depths of darkness, light can find its way through. And as his grandchildren listened, wide-eyed and silent, he would unwrap a Hershey bar, the kind he kept in his desk drawer even decades after the war, and break it into pieces for them to share. The chocolate would melt on their tongues, sweet and rich, and he would smile, remembering a time when such simple pleasures had felt like miracles, when the taste of chocolate had meant the difference between despair and hope. The story of Camp Trinidad, of the German prisoners who wept over coffee and chocolate, became one of those footnotes in history that few remember, but everyone should. It was not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic, not decisive in the way treaties are decisive, but it mattered nonetheless, because it proved something essential about human nature. It proved that even when nations descend into madness, individuals can choose differently. That guards can show mercy to prisoners, that enemies can become, if not friends, then at least fellow survivors of a catastrophe, neither created but both endured. That a Hershey bar given freely can mean more than 1,000 speeches about freedom and democracy. The prisoners who passed through those gates carried that lesson with them for the rest of their lives. Some became teachers, others politicians, a few even returned to America to live. But all of them remembered what it felt like to be treated with dignity, when they expected only cruelty, to receive kindness when they deserved condemnation, to taste chocolate and realize that the world they had been taught to believe in was a lie. And in remembering, they became witnesses to a truth larger than war, that mercy is not weakness, that compassion costs nothing but gives everything, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating your enemy like a human being. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.